Retro now.
Hello there. This is James Arnold Taylor, the voice of Obi-Wan Kenobi, and you're listening to Dennis and Jay on Podcast Stardust. Their behavior is continuously unexpected. So uncivilized.
Welcome to Podcast Stardust. This is the fully armed and operational podcast dedicated to Star Wars news, reviews, and discussion. We are your galactic representatives. I'm Dennis Keithley.
And I'm Jay Krebs.
And we're also your host for this podcast. This episode is going to feature our discussion of Alexander Freed's Reign of Empire, Mask of Fear. We've been meaning to get this for a few months now, and we're finally here. Jay, you want to go ahead and give everyone our social media contacts before we get started?
Absolutely. It's so sublime. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Podcast Stardust.
Watch yourself. I'll throw you into Oubliette. Okay.
Nice.
All right. The dish is aligned. The signal is boosted to maximum output. These references will make sense in a moment. The shield is down, and we are now broadcasting to the galaxy. And so once again, this is going to be our discussion of Reign of Empire, Mask of Fear, which was a novel written by Alexander Freed. It is the first in a trilogy of Reign of Empire. It's the first in a trilogy of Reign of Empire novels, the second and third of which will be coming out in the next 2 years from Rebecca Roanhorse and Fran Wild. This book takes place in the days after Order 66 and the organization of the Republic into an empire. And the series is primarily going to focus on Mon Mothma, Bail Organa, and Saw Gerrera. So that's kind of a little bit of a backdrop for you. We're going to get to some spoilers, but before we do that, Jay, you want to go ahead and let us know what your non-spoiler overall thoughts are about this book?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I know that this book came out very early in the year, but honestly, I think it's a perfect time for us to be reviewing this, especially in the aftermath, if you will, of Andor, because it is perfectly placed in terms of setting us up for, as you mentioned, our three main characters in Saw Gerrera, Mon Mothma, and Bail Organa, and as well as, as you said, what was going on in the aftermath of post Order 66, the very early stages of the empire, and how all of these worlds were transitioning from the Galactic Republic and the Separatists into what is now known as the Empire, and also just dealing with specific people, specific areas, specific planets, as far as the siege of Coruscant, which I never really thought of in that way, and what was going on Coruscant at the time, and just some of the individual struggles that some of these entities, these people were going through. I will say that the type of political intrigue that this book gets into is pretty heavy. And honestly, if it would have been 10 years ago, I probably wouldn't have been as intrigued and excited about this book as I am because of the Andor series and coming off of that type of storytelling. And, Alexander Freed in general, amazing writer, so incredible. But, some of his past works, I wasn't exactly the biggest fan of. I was not a big fan of Alphabet Squadron, even though it was a great series, not my favorite. But I just think he knocked this one out of the park personally. And I was so here for it. It wasn't a page turner in the aspect that, it was like, ooh, what's going to happen next? But it definitely kept my interest and my intrigue. And I bought into it so deeply.
Well, see, it was a page turner for me, very much so. When this book first came out and I got my copy, it was a few days after it came out before I could pick it up. And once I did, I got through it in like 2-3 days. Read
Wow.
through it. Yeah, I mean, I kept picking it back up. in particular, it was the Mon Mothma and Bail Organa storylines that interested
Mm,
me the most. It follows really like 5 characters around pretty closely throughout the course of the book, and those two really, really intrigued me what was going on with them. And I really liked the setting. The days after the end of that war and the fall of the Jedi, the organization of the Empire. That's what this is all about. And there were some things that just really struck to me that we'll get to a bit more as we get to our spoiler discussion about this. I reread the book over the last week to prepare for this discussion. And, the first time I read it was well before Andor season 2 came out. And this is now after, this reading was after Andor season 2. And overall, I think it works pretty well with that series. I do have some things I want to ask you about as we get through our conversation about if it makes as much sense. But no major gripes when it comes to it. There's a character in here by the name of Sujin, who is a former separatist that we'll talk about quite a bit. He got on my nerves the second time I read this book. Not that I couldn't be at least a little bit sympathetic towards him, but one of the issues I had with Alphabet Squadron in that trilogy was just the angst, the amount of anxiety that's between the covers of those books. And
mhm.
Sujin has that in spades here. He
Oh,
kind
he
of,
does.
yeah, he brings that grittiness level up to 10, goes to 11 and 12 on it there. And so a couple times it's like, I'm ready to be done with you, Sujin. So, but we'll talk about that as some as well. But again, it's a good book. I like it. There's the second reading made me cognizant of some finer points that tied into Revenge of the Sith that were really
Mhm.
pretty cool. And I'm eager to talk about those. So, with no further ado on this, that's kind of our overall thoughts on this. I highly recommend it. It's
Yes.
probably my favorite Alexander Freed book that's out there, and I can't say that I won't read it again in the future, especially before the second and third book comes out in the series.
Yes,
Um,
I agree. And,
so,
real quickly, when I say it
mhm,
wasn't a page turner for me,
mhm,
it wasn't because it wasn't exciting. It was because the fact that it was so heavy
yeah.
that I had to just like put it down and be like, okay, I need to digest this just a little bit and then
Sure.
I can go back to it.
Yeah, well, there's a couple times it's like, "Oh, that just happened to Mon," and then the next chapter is about Sujin. It's like, "I need to get through this so I can find out what happened to Mon." It's
Yeah.
just like sometimes, and so that was my reading, my experience on it. But yeah, your mileage may vary, and that's all cool. Okay, so again, we're kind of getting into the details of the book now. The series was described, last year when it was coming out as exploring the interaction and the paths that Mon Mothma, Bail Organa, and Saw Gerrera take in this time between the fall of the Republic and the beginning, and A New Hope, the Battle of Yavin. This book is very heavy on Mon Mothma, Bail Organa, and then out of the three of those, Saw gets a lot less attention on this. And there's Sujin, who is this new character that we haven't seen anything else, kind of is the proxy for Saw's participation in the book in a lot of ways on this.
Mhm.
There's a couple of other main characters. There is a Haki who is affiliated with the Imperial Intelligence, and then her de facto apprentice Chemish are the other kind of. They're not the main characters, but they'd be the B characters that get more attention than anybody else. Which one of the storylines captivated you the most in this book?
Oh gosh, that's such a hard question because they were so integrated with each other that it's
Mhm.
hard to really separate them quite, specifically, but because they all affect each other.
Sure.
But I really appreciated the relationship between Mon and Bale and what they were each trying to do.
Mhm.
And also in the fact that they were represented as not being perfect. You know
Right.
what I mean? That they were human, they had fears, they had needs, they had insecurities, they had, doubts about what they were doing as far as, is this the right thing? Is this the ethical thing? I mean, there was a lot of gray area with ethics and morals and just the roles that they were playing and their motivations for doing things. And so I was really intrigued with the the almost like the psychoanalysis of those characters from a very personal kind of lens. And so I think for me, just that whole idea of how they were struggling as senators and, as people, and for Bale especially, with his almost obsession to try to prove that the Jedi were wronged.
Mhm.
And, the fact that he was doing that to preserve a future for Leia and what that meant to him. And I also thought it was very interesting how they often referred to Padme as almost like the glue that held them together, kind of thing. That it's
Yeah.
like almost like what would Padme do in this situation? And if Padme were here, how would she have reacted to this? And because Padme did this, like, I want to do that. And of course, Bale always had that in his mind because, of course, Padme is Leia's true mother. But, I just think that whole idea is, between that the ethics, morals, and and just the struggles, the personal ghosts even that they were all dealing with, that it was just that was what I think intrigued me the most.
Yeah, for me, Bale and Mon were 1A, and this, and then everything else, it was a bit, 2 was farther down the line. The second time I read this around, I really didn't have a lot, as I was saying earlier, I didn't have a lot of patience for Sujan in this, because well, we'll get into that. But between Bale and Mon, I'm just going to pick one in that case based off your answer. And we'll start off with Mon Mothma here. And your comments about Padme, I'm going to put aside just for a second because there's a lot of characters that don't actually appear in this book that have a whole lot of influence on what
Mhm.
everyone's doing here. And she's a big one. But unlike Bale, she isn't particularly concerned about the Jedi. She looks at them as this is a cause that the galaxy rejected, and no matter what the truth is about the Jedi, it's not going to get us anywhere. Her goal is to wrest power back away from Palpatine. And what I found fascinating about that is that she really has no idea that Palpatine is a Sith Lord.
Right.
In all of this. She just knows that this is a man who accumulated power, and the Senate is guilty for letting him do it this entire time. And so her response to that is to create the Imperial Rebirth Act. And then she spends a significant chunk of this book recruiting support for it, starting with members of the delegation of 2000, which that right away grabbed my attention because we never actually saw the delegation of 2000 in Revenge of the Sith. That
Mhm.
was a cut scene, but Star Wars fans, those that are really invested, know what that delegation is because it's come up time and
Right.
again, and to see them here was pretty cool.
Oh, it's very cool. And just being able to get to know the specific people that were part of that
Uh-huh.
and what their value systems were, and and again, just the machinations of like all of the different individual delegates and what their perspectives were. And just I gotta give my take my hat off to Mon because she really worked it in terms of drawing that line between, okay, yes, what can you do for this versus, coming right out and saying she doesn't like Bail Organa, for
Uh-huh.
example, but she can appreciate what they're working for and what they're working towards.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was impressed with that.
She kind of says that before they come to realize how much they depend on each other and they're going to need
Right.
each other going forward towards the end of the book.
Mhm.
But one of the other things is just that they say, she's putting her political skills to work in this book. It's that she knows Palpatine is the villain in all this, and he needs to be kept in check. So she's going to do what she does best. She crafts a bill. She starts lobbying for support. She starts promising things. It's like an analogy for what happens in our country. You get all these
Mhm.
pork added to bills, and she's adding things, and then she realizes, oh, this person's more powerful and they have more influence. I need to compromise with them, but that's going to lose me this other person. Well, that's just one vote. This gives me five. So she's playing that game this
Oh,
entire
yeah.
time on it. And she gets the bill crafted, but she wins. She gets injured, and we'll get to that eventually. And so she's not there for the vote on the floor. But then she has that face off with Masameda, And he's like, yeah, congratulations on your bill. Of course, the emperor is going to veto. He's going to veto this because he is, in fact, the emperor after all. And
Mhm.
so the power is not going to get wrested back from it. But all these other things that you wanted to do, yeah, that's fine. Funding for this planet and these orphans, that's great. Respect for the rights of droids, great, whatever. The ability to make sure that people can still use their droids, that's all fantastic. But the whole point of the bill basically gets set aside because Masameda and Palpatine decided it would.
Right.
In
Yeah.
this, yeah,
Yeah, exactly. Which in all, reality, it just goes to show that I mean, Palpatine's gonna do what Palpatine's gonna do, and it doesn't matter.
right, yeah. Well, I mean, there's this conversation that Mon and Bale have about democracy, and the point gets made, and I think they're actually having this conversation with Saw Gerrera, that they are trying to do what's best for the galaxy and the people in the galaxy, but they also acknowledge that the Empire at this stage is what the people want. They just don't want to be
Mhm.
involved in a war anymore. And so what they're doing is, in fact, anti-democratic at this point.
Right.
Of course, it's a very ironic situation because by the time we get to A New Hope, it's the Emperor that's anti-democratic, and it's Bale and Mon and Saw that are trying to restore the democracy of all this. But at this stage of the game, Palpatine is the duly elected leader of the galaxy. He is the will of the people, but then he abuses that power.
Exactly. Yeah, and I mean, it all starts with the siege of Coruscant when, you've got all this debris and you've got all of these things that are, hitting these living areas and whatnot, and the war got real for people,
Mhm.
and not only on Coruscant, but all over the galaxy. And it kind of goes back to even what Jin said in Rogue One, as far as, oh, you can stand to see the Empire's flag fly. Well, it is a problem if you don't look up.
Right.
People want stability, they want predictability, they want peace. And that's essentially, even though they don't see the specifics of what Palpatine is doing, obviously, and what his long term goals are, what they see as the day to day, and that to them is the most important thing, and that's what they're fighting against.
What did you think about Mon's relationship with Perrin in this book?
Oh gosh, like, it was all over the place. I mean, I truly feel like, it goes back to what she talked about in Andor and how young they were when they were betrothed and they got married, and that there's such this back and forth. I truly feel that she does love him,
Mhm.
in terms of that bond that they share with one another. But it's almost like, in some ways, I hate to say like a love-hate relationship, but yet it is, in the fact that she knows that he is kind of her rock in a lot of ways, and that she can always count on him, and that he worries about her, she worries about him. But it's almost like that borderline relationship, or sense of duty that they have to each other, that can become very non-emotional as well. And so, I think Mon is also thirsting for that connection. And so, with Maroi, for example, she often catches herself thinking about how things could be different with him, or she even fabricates that lie of the affair that they had, that they
Mhm.
didn't have, obviously. But I think that there was part of her that kind of wishes that that could have actually happened. And so I feel like, too, at the end, when they share their little intimacy, I was like, oh, that's probably where their daughter came from
Later,
by the
yeah.
time she in Andor.
Especially since Mon's
But
reaction is like, "When was the last time that happened?"
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So, I think it's a very complicated relationship. So, yeah, I don't quite have like a really, really clear answer for that. But I mean, that's about as best as I can do. But what do you think?
I think it made their relationship in Andor plausible
Mhm.
because they Alexander Freed kind of explains the equilibrium that they've achieved in the relationship. As you were describing it, they got betrothed and married when they were teenagers. And, it was a torrid affair, if you could explain it. And then they kind of cooled to each other. But then by the time they were 24, they were in love again and carrying on that way. But then, the pendulum would swing the other direction, and then they were just kind of standoffish. But we saw time and again in this book, like when Mon Mothma's assistant, Zuna, gets murdered in Mon Mothma house, and it's Perrin who comes home and finds the assailant. He's the one that, calls the police. And then when Mon Mothma shows up, he's the one that interjects with the police. Like, that's my wife. He's standing
Right.
up for her, even though they've had moments of aggravation with each other. And then, towards the end of this book, when she's the one, spoiler for the rest of the conversation, she's the one responsible for Sujan getting killed. That's the whole oubliette and sublime trigger words we were talking about at the top of this episode.
Mm-hmm.
He shows up at her hospital room and then doesn't leave until she makes him on that.
Yes.
He stands vigil for her. And so it is just kind of we see that the back and forth of the relationship, the waxing and waning of their feelings for each other. And by the time we see them in Andor, it makes sense that, they haven't left each other because that's just who they are. It's, they may
Mm-hmm.
not like each other a whole lot in this moment, but they work together well. I mean, she used, and I don't want to say like maliciously, but she gave him a task. It's like, go get Bail off of the topic of the fate of the Jedi at that party they were having. Go get him talking about something else. He's like, yep, got it. And he went and he did his assignment. He was perfectly willing to do so. So anyways, I felt that made what was going on in Andor work. Not that
Mm-hmm.
it didn't, but it worked better, I suppose.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. And you put it very well.
All right. Well, let's move on from Mon. Let's talk about something else in the book here. One of the things that really impressed me and stood out to me was this planet of Io de Juretz, which was a galactic heritage world like Coruscant. It was an ecumenopolis. So it was a planet that was totally overrun by a city, except for the difference is it's now in ruins. It was a pre-Republic civilization, and whatever happened to the civilization, nobody knows. But now the elements have started to reclaim the world. They fossilized some of the buildings there, and it's a planet that people aren't allowed to just go to and land on the surface. It is protected, and it's only like historians and archaeologists that get to go there. It just so happens it is where the separatists that created this character Sujan, that we'll eventually get to, hid a major stash of weapons, including Sujan. That's why we end up going back to this planet. But before we get into the details of what happened there, what'd you think about Io de Juretz?
Oh my gosh, it's obviously, like you said, it's one of the standout elements, and it reveals, I mean, it's really symbolic as a setting, I feel like, as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, as you said, there's a lot of things that are going on there. It was, a lot of cultural unity, there was a lot of education. It was kind of like the galaxy's archive in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
But and I think that Alexander Freed does a really good job of using it not just as a location, but kind of this living metaphor for the state of the galaxy, post the Clone Wars. It was once kind of unified by ideals, but now it's like fragmented by all of these different types of things. And then like impending erasure, if you will, and it's very similar in a lot of ways to it feeling like Jeddah after, Jeddah was destroyed. And, really interesting things like there's all of these different sorts of things like sky bridges and towers that are leaning at dangerous angles. We see these like data vaults that hold these broken memory crystals and corrupted holos and all of these different types of things. And what's really kind of cool is that, this is where Sujan is originally from. And so kind of going back there for him is, so symbolic in a lot of ways for him too, I feel like.
Yeah, it's where they stashed them. The pirates raided it
Right. Yeah, exactly.
and picked them up. And then, of course, stole them from the pirates when they raided the pirate ship on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I loved the moments that were on this world. Just kind of some of the descriptions. Just thinking of Coruscant and this ancient state. Like we go look at things like Mayan temples or the
Yes.
pyramids in Egypt and the like, and the ruins in Rome and stuff like that. And there's this notion, it's like, oh, that's not impressive. But then you realize it's, you see what the, pictures of what those actually would have looked like in their heyday. And we are given the benefit of like, we know what Coruscant looks like. And Io de Juretz would have been something like that. But then it's described in the same terms of ancient ruins that we have here on Earth. And
Mhm.
that just so captured my imagination. I was like, I want to see this. I want to see artwork of this. I would love to see it in like a video game, like one of the Jedi Fallen Order
Oh,
or Survivor
yeah.
type games where you go to that to try and find something there. And the notion of like while they're wandering around at one point, their comms would randomly activate because there's these ancient broadcasts that are still bouncing around down there. And so, Sujin would call it the ghost of our Degerits there. And
Yeah.
no one knew what they were saying because the language has been long gone there. But then there's this massive dam that Saw Gerrera and his partisans end up blowing up to cover their escape and ends up ruining a whole huge section of the planet out of that.
Mhm.
And, it's like, I've never seen this planet before this book, but I was really upset that they destroyed a significant portion of it because Mon Mothma would talk about this planet glowingly, how she got to go there and how it captivated her attention, and there was just this impact on so many people when word got out that a significant chunk of it reminded me, like, after all the outcry when that tourist vandalized the Roman Colosseum, carved
Oh, yeah.
carved their initials into the wall. And it's like, how dare you do that? And that was just carving initials into the wall. But, these ancient buildings were toppled by the destruction of that dam here. And so it's just like, I could really feel that. And that just really impressed me.
Right, right, and that's what I was saying, it's very similar to Jeddah in that way, in that, it was like the holy city and quote unquote was completely demolished. And so, and it kind of struck me too that, as far as Saw is concerned, you could almost look at this as cultural genocide in a lot of ways, that there's
Mhm.
such like, as you said, such a reverence for the ancient culture and what it all represents on Io de Juritz. And this isn't the first time, obviously, that Saw has done, the act of genocide in a lot of ways. And, we see that again in Rebels, even though Click-Clack ends up
Right.
surviving.
Mhm.
But, it's kind of like, no wonder, Mon often refers to him as a radicalist, because this is obviously point in or case in point kind of thing. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's just the fact that this is this galactic heritage world, is it really did captivate my attention as well.
Yeah. So we're running out of time in this episode, so we're going to have to pick up this conversation in another episode. But I do want to, we'll put Bail Organa aside because we're going to talk about him probably next time because he deserves as much attention as Mon Mothma did, and so does Sojin on this. But one of the things that you brought up earlier, I wanted to touch on was kind of the importance of Padme there, and there's a theme, and we're not going to get through all of it. This is like there's characters that we don't actually ever see in this book. They get mentioned, but they have a huge impact on this in the book. And one of those is Padme. She was this ally of Mon Mothma. She was, as you mentioned, an ally of Bail Organa's, the mother of his adopted daughter. And they both feel this obligation to her to protect democracy and stuff like that. And, her name comes up, how many dozens of times in the book.
Mhm.
But they, Alexander Freed does a fantastic job of hitting the mark without overdoing it in this book. She is we just talked about the ghost of Iowa Dirt. She's a ghost in
Oh,
this book.
yeah.
And here, I mean, so, a little bit more. Why was she so important?
Well, I think she's important to different characters in different ways, but there's also a collective reverence for her as well. Obviously for Bale, as I said, not only is she the mother of Leia, but she also he says oftentimes she loved the Jedi. And
Mhm.
obviously she loved a specific Jedi,
Right.
but that was part of what Bale's whole, MO was in the storyline, was to try to exonerate the Jedi from what they were, said to have done and all of the lies that were perpetrated. So, I think for in Bale's situation, that was part of his reason for focusing on Padme. And as far as what Mon was concerned, she was kind of the measure or the yardstick, if you will, of what different types of things were happening, and as far as like moral courage. You know what I mean? So she
Mhm.
was this, as far as Padme went, she was a diplomat. She tried to prevent war. Mon even said that she was on the same, she was trying to vote on the same act that Padme did for the oh shoot, I can't remember the one that she was going to vote on, Padme was, but Mon said she was part of that same, voting kind of thing. But Padme tried to prevent war even when war was politically popular. She opposed the emergency powers. She was, all of these things that I think Mon was in line with and also valued. And now both of them are kind of forced to compromise in ways that Padme never did. So Mon and Bail both have this kind of kindred spirit, if you will, in Padme that allows them to connect with each other in a way that, like I said, it's kind of like this yardstick of what would Padme do kind of
Yeah,
thing.
I think you pretty much nailed it there. They're carrying on her legacy on this.
Yes.
She more than anybody was the one that recognized this war is not ending. She says to Anakin, "Do you ever get the feeling we're on the wrong side of this? We're fighting for
Yeah.
the wrong side." And so there's this recognition here that how much of a mistake was made giving the Chancellor emergency powers and not doing something about it when they actually could. And now they're left in a position where there's no negotiating with the Emperor. They have to take action to do something about it. And of course, they get outmaneuvered there too. But one of the things that really touched me was when it came time to vote on the Imperial Rebirth Act. Bail delivers the speech to introduce the bill and talks about everything that Saw Gerrera put him through. He lied about some of it, but Saw Gerrera did not mind at all. He got the notoriety of all that.
Right.
But once the vote goes to the floor and he's watching as the clock starts running and the senators are all casting their votes, and C-3PO and his only appearance in this book is
Yes.
standing next to Bail, and 3PO is like, "Oh, you're doing very well," and all this, and Bail looks at him as like, "Stay with me, 3PO," and it was like that proxy for Padme that right
Yes.
there that entire time. He he's got this vote on the floor that he knows Padme would have approved of, and now there's some comfort in having some piece of Padme there with him as he watches the results.
Yes, and I'm so glad that you brought that up because that was kind of a chilling metaphor in a lot of ways. Because, I mean, here we know that 3PO is serving Bail with a wiped memory, and that was
Mhm.
specifically, mentioned, and there was, the reasons why that happened. But, 3PO recalling Padme, in her kindness, it was just so chilling.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah.
I did take issue with the line in the book where, Bale's reflecting on how he had 3PO's mind wiped out of necessity. And I was like, that it was completely not necessary.
Right?
I will stand up for 3PO to the end on that one. He did not, he didn't wipe R2's memory, and he knows just as much as 3PO does. So, uh,
Mhm.
well, there's a whole lot more to talk about with this book. So, and we originally intended to cover it all here, but we would probably be here for another 45 minutes. We tried to do that. So we're going to go ahead and end part one of our discussion, and we'll pick this up next week with the second half of the discussion. And so with that having been said, thank you all for joining us for the first part of our discussion of uh, Reign of Empire, Mask of Fear. And we hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't read this book, go do so before we get into our second half of our discussion. And once you've done all that, make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you can get that episode when it comes out in a week or two, whenever we get around to it. But it will be soon. And once you've subscribed to the podcast, we'd really appreciate it if you could go ahead and give us that 5-star rating, a written review. It helps others find the show. You know how this works. I'm sure you hear it on every podcast you listen to. And then if you want to find more from the show, then head over to retrozap.com and you can hear all previous 897 shows. We've been around since 2019. We've been talking Star Wars for a long time. We got a lot to say, and you can find all of it there. So, Jay, you want to go ahead and remind everybody what our social media contacts are and where else we can find around the internet?
I would love to. So we are very easily and conveniently found on Facebook and Instagram at Podcast Stardust. And you can also hit us up on our YouTube outlet. So we are on the traditional YouTube as well as YouTube Music. And you can subscribe to both of those. And also let us know what you think of these episodes. And it's very interactive as well. So hit us up there. And you can also check us out on our Pinterest board. So we have lots and lots of fun Star Wars ideas over there. So once again, check us out on Pinterest. And then we also have a public store where you can pick up everything from home goods and apparel and pretty much everything in between. And every one of those purchases does help to support the show. So if you're interested in making a purchase, you can head over to the link in our show notes.
All right. What's going on in cosplay?
All right, so you can always catch me on Instagram at j.snipscosplay, sporting my favorite cosplays as Ahsoka, the fourth sister, 2 different versions of Hera, and my original concept Mandalorian, as well as Leia from time to time. Also some other things as well. So you can check out everything that I'm up to as far as appearances and just fun upcoming events. And once again, that is at j.snipscosplay.
All right. Upcoming on the show on Friday, we'll be getting into the news. And right now, it looks like on Monday, we will pick up with our discussion on Reign of Empire. That's subject to change, but so thanks for listening to episode 898 of Podcast Stardust, everyone. Have a great rest of your week. And until next time, may the Force be with you.